Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies for making this event possible. It's my privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. John Dunne, sitting here. So, Professor Dunne received his PhD from Harvard University in the study of religion, and he currently holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also holds the position of a distinguished professor, double position, at the university's Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, where he serves as department chair. Prior to his move to Wisconsin in 2016, Professor Dunne was associate professor of religious studies at Emory University and has taught over the years at numerous academic public contexts, including the Ranjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu, Nepal, the affiliated Gomde Centers of Denmark and Austria, and the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Professor Dunne's work focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in dialogue with cognitive science and psychology. His numerous publications appear in venues ranging across both the humanities and the sciences, and they include works in Buddhist philosophy, contemplative practice, and their interpretation within scientific, philosophical, and cultural contexts. In the domain of Buddhist philosophical studies, Professor Dunne is perhaps best known for his 2004 publication, Foundations of Dharmakirti's Philosophy. He is also known for his contribution, together with Tukdam Jinpa, to the second volume of the series, Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics, titled The Mind. So this work, guided by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is an invaluable resource for exploring Buddhist approaches to psychology and philosophy of mind. I might also add that it's a really wonderful resource for assigning undergraduate readings, if you're interested in that. And tonight, John will be speaking on the fascinating topic of contemplative dying in Tibetan Buddhism with a talk entitled Between Life and Death, Understanding Tukdam. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor John Dunne.
Thank you. Let me change mics here. Okay. So thanks very much, James. Nice to be here. Good to see everybody. And some old familiar faces. We're a small audience. Some especially old familiar faces. But we're a small audience, so I will speak I'm supposed to go for about 90 minutes, I think. Roughly. We'll see how the energy goes, and we'll take time for questions at the end. But if there's things that come up in the middle, since it's a small audience, I'm open to you kind of asking questions as we're going along the way, if you like. So I am going to talk about Tukdam, and I'm going to try to explore this idea in terms of, first of all, kind of what do we mean by it theoretically, and what do we mean by it on the ground, and then what kind of research have we been conducting on Tukdam. And I'll begin by just saying, well, literally, what does it mean? What does this word, Tukdam, mean? It is actually, so first of all, it's actually an honorific term in Tibetan, and it has multiple meanings. And the multiplicity, the polysemia of the term actually is, in some ways, foreshadows certain issues that are going to become obvious as we explore this idea. So one of its meanings is actually, it's the honorific term for damsik in Tibetan, or samaya, which basically means sort of one's tantric vow. So this is really going to be in the context of tantric Buddhism, tantric Buddhist practice. And so one term simply is it means that vows that one takes as a tantric practitioner. Another that's actually closely related, but not exactly the same, is the idea of a damcha. So it's also the honorific term for this, damcha, which kind of means a commitment or a promise. It can also mean something in philosophy, actually, but in this usage it doesn't. So basically these two usages are going to be very similar. They're both referring to, in some sense or another, formal vows or informal commitments that one has as a tantric practitioner in Tibetan Buddhism. It also is the honorific term for yidam, which means one's chosen deity. And I'll be explaining that for those of you who are not familiar with these concepts. And finally, it means practicing any of the above. So basically, in a way, it sort of just refers to tantric practice. It's an honorific term for tantric practice. Then specifically, when we use it in the specific, so it occurs, so for example, you could speak about Tukdam Kang, which means to fulfill your commitment, and that actually would be something that wouldn't necessarily, probably doesn't apply to a human tantric practitioner. It applies to a non-human tantric practitioner, like a local spirit who has been converted to Buddhism and now has certain commitments, damcha or tukdam honorifically, that they have to fulfill for the local tantric community. So that would be one way of talking about practicing. Well, maybe the practice involves actually non-human spirits that one is bringing to fulfill their commitments. But it also can mean, of course, just a human tantric practitioner engaging in practice in general, but then very specifically, metonymically perhaps, it refers to a particular meditative state that can accomplish the central goals of tantric practice, right? A particular kind of state that occurs at death, as we will see. So again, it's a term that actually has multiple meanings. It actually doesn't even map onto a single term in ordinary non-honorific Tibetan. And that's, as I said, that's going to be something that we'll be dealing with. And here on the right-hand side, actually, what we have is a picture of one of the subjects of our research. And this is actually a picture that I didn't ask Dunne if I could use, by Dunne Coleman. Thanks, Dunne. Send me the bill, yes. Of course, Dunne's film is going to be shown tomorrow. So the film that's about this phenomenon is going to be shown tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Yeah. So when we talk about a theoretical account of Tukdam, this is actually the volume that James just mentioned. And if you'd like to learn more about some of these details, I really highly recommend that you consult this volume. One of the features of this volume, and also the presentation I'm going to give to you now, is that it's primarily coming from a Gelugpa perspective. So if you're not familiar with this term, this refers to one of the four main traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, and the Gelugpa turn out to have become the most dominant politically and numerically, perhaps we could say. It's a perspective that there are a few reasons why I've chosen it. One of them is that what I want to present to you when I present this theoretical perspective is I want to give you something that in some sense sort of is anthropologically emic. It's what, if you went to an educated Tibetan, Gelugpa specifically, Tibetan Buddhist practitioner of Tantra and asked, what is Tukdam? The kind of presentation I'm going to give to you now is a perhaps simplified version of that. So that means we're talking about modern practitioners, someone you could go talk to now. And this is a modern volume that was sponsored by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's originally written in Tibetan, and then we translated it from Tibetan into English. And I also wrote a few essays. And you may find the essay on subtle and coarse bodies in the volume useful if you want to explore this more. And there's a whole chapter on this topic in that volume. So, Gelugpa perspective, partially I want to represent something emic, but also I want to, I'm doing this because my own background actually was in the 80s. I received quite a lot of education, I guess you could say, in tantric practice from the Gelugpa perspective. And my own, in a sense, engagement with this material was originally from that context. But I say mostly Gelugpa perspective because there are going to be a couple of points where we need to step back and understand some aspects of Tantra that are not just about the Gelug. One thing about this type of material in general, what's presented in this volume and what you might read in Tibetan commentaries on Tantra, also what you might hear from a Tibetan practitioner who's educated in this material, and that this is often a point of confusion in contemplative studies. When you read a text that says, this is what happens when you do this practice. For example, some of you might be familiar with the Bhavana Krama, the Stages of Meditation by Kamalashila, a very famous 8th century text. That is not a description, it's a prescription. It's telling you what you're supposed to do. It's not telling you what actually happens when you practice. And we know that in part because what frequently happens is that a text says one thing, and then one goes and actually observes or asks, how do we do this? And the practitioners say, oh, we don't do that part, actually. So, I mean, in the Tantric context, when I was being trained in the 80s in sort of Tantric ritual arts, which is a part of engaging in this type of practice to its fullest extent, I'm going to mention my friend Pema Losang Chögyam later. And Pema pointed out that we were learning how to build mandalas, and I'll describe what that means shortly. But as he was describing it, he said, here's the text that's about this. It's actually a translation of a Sanskrit text that's been a bit edited and clarified by Tibetan scholars. But you notice this one part where it's talking about how the beams fit together, and I was reading, and I realized that's impossible. The beams have to be both 2 spans wide and 1 span wide simultaneously. And he said, yeah, we don't do it that way. Make your choice. You just have to make it up. So text can say one thing, practices can mean something else. Or let me restate that. Text can say one thing, but the way one actually practices can be quite different. So that's something very important to keep in mind. The theoretical account I'm going to give is something that is based on Sanskrit text, but it's interpreted through a really highly scholastic framework, and I'm thinking especially influential in this volume is going to be the work of the 14th, the 15th century Tibetan Buddhist exegete and practitioner Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa lineage. And one of the ways, not just Tsongkhapa, but Tibetan Buddhism in general, when it moves into this scholastic mode, the goal is to leave no loose ends. Everything has to fit together neatly. There can't be anything that is questioned, really. All things must be explained systematically. And that means that, again, certain kinds of problems in practice that might require a certain degree of, let's say, imprecision or even deliberate ambiguity is very rarely found in this kind of scholastic approach. So having said all that, now some of you are going to be quite familiar with what I'm going to talk about, but I wasn't sure whether that would apply to everyone in this audience. So I'm just going to review a couple of things about kind of the basic context of this style of practice and what's Tukdam for, in a sense. Why would we even think of it as something that's important to talk about? And I'm just beginning with this very simple point, which is that in Mahayana Buddhist practice, and this is, of course, the style of Buddhism we find in Tibet, the practitioner seeks to attain samyak sambodhi in Sanskrit, or zopar sangye in Tibetan. They seek to become fully awakened, or a Buddha. And the motivation for this is said to be that they seek to eliminate the suffering of all sentient beings, and they do that by basically helping beings to help themselves, in a sense. So it's really becoming maximally effective at being a teacher, actually. And this is what is said to be distinctive of a Buddha. Other kinds of Buddhist practitioners can attain nirvana, but it's said from the standpoint of Mahayana theory that a Buddha is special because a Buddha can teach in this incredibly effective way. That's, again, from the Tibetan standpoint. The fundamental obstacle to become a Buddha is described as avidya in Sanskrit or marikba in Tibetan, and it basically means a fundamental ignorance or misunderstanding that's not just intellectual, that's also affective, that manifests itself in behavior, a misunderstanding about the nature of reality itself, which means that you can eliminate that ignorance by seeing the nature of reality, the ultimate nature of reality, and that kind of state. And this is complicated. Can you really see the ultimate? There's a really big question there philosophically, which I won't go into right now. One of my projects is a translation of a text that's all about that, called the Prasanna Buddha. But in any case, let's just say what we're talking about is wisdom. Wisdom is what's going to uproot that ignorance. Now, we take that into the tantric context, and here we see a Tibetan-style depiction of one of the most important tantric deities for the Gelugpa sect, or the Gelugpa tradition. This is called Guhya Samaja. It's the central figure of that practice, the so-called secret community, the Guhya Samaja or Sangmartupa. And this is one of 3 primary practices for Gelugpa monks. They practice Guhya Samaja, Chakra Samvara or Demchok, and Dorje Jigje or Vajrabhairava. We'll be talking about why that's relevant soon. But basically, from a tantric perspective, again, from the sort of theoretical Tibetan account, there's a lot more going on in Tantra than what this is saying. Tantra is not just emerging out of Buddhism in India. There's a lot of interactions among traditions. And those traditions are sharing ideas, they're sharing techniques, they're also actually in combat at times. There's a lot of material in Tantra about, sort of magical combat, sorcery, if you like. So there's a lot more to it than this. This, again, is the kind of scholastic version of it. But scholastically, we'd say, according to the Tantric approach, really everything is about, remember, the whole goal is you want to become a Buddha. The only way you can become a Buddha is to see the nature of ultimate reality with the motivation of relieving the suffering of sentient beings. And in order to do that, you have to cultivate this wisdom. But in the Tantric context, it said that the best way to cultivate that wisdom, the most effective way, the quickest way, actually, is to do so by seeing the ultimate nature of the mind in its most fundamental form. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is because the mind is the basis of reality. Now, this is where we need to step back a little bit from the Gelugpa perspective, because the Gelugpas don't really like that position. They're not happy with the notion that what is essentially coming out of Yogacara, what's called Yogacara philosophy, we can call it a form of idealism in Indian Buddhism. When that comes to Tibet, the Gelugpa tradition eventually rejects really almost everything about Yogacara. But Tantra itself really emerges out of that perspective, which is essentially that the only thing we have access to is our own experience. So if we want to understand the nature of reality, that means we have to understand the nature of our own experience. So that is the original driving perspective for this claim that if we're going to really understand the ultimate nature of reality, it means understanding the ultimate nature of the mind. But another reason, and this is the one the Gelugpas endorse, right? So the or is for the Gelugpas, is because this approach produces the most powerful or effective form of wisdom. And there are multiple reasons for that. We can talk about that later if you're interested about what is it about focusing on the nature of the mind itself that somehow produces a more powerful form of wisdom. We can talk about that later. Now, in any case, we want to do this with a particular state of mind. We want to get down, in a sense, to the foundational state of mind, a most fundamental form of mind, and that occurs at death. Okay? So with that in mind, and here's one of the more Tibetan prediction of one of the most important Mahasiddhas, great adepts of India, Tilopa. With that in mind, then, what do? Well, the method involves being fully aware of the solid state of mind that occurs at death, known as the clear light, Ösel, or Prabhasura in Sanskrit, the clear light mind. That'll become clear as we go through how this process emerges. To rehearse that moment, essentially what one does is you induce a simulated version of this clear light mind. It's not the actual version of the clear light mind, because the actual clear light mind, which is called the Dhungi Ösel, only occurs at death. So this is what's called the Pei Ösel, a metaphorical or simulated version of this clear light mind. And you can do that while you're alive. The simulation, however, requires a high degree of control over the winds, lung in Tibetan, or vayu in Sanskrit, not prana, but vayu in Sanskrit, that are involved in the death process. So in brief, we'll explore this a little bit more in a few minutes, but I'll just say in brief, the tantric perspective here is that the mind-body system operates through a kind of energy. And that energy flows in various patterns. There are different forms of energy, 5 primary forms and 5 secondary forms of energy, and they flow in channels in the body. And at the time of death, there's a certain kind of configuration of those energies that occur. And you can actually, in a sense, force those energies. Maybe that's not the right term, but some people would agree with that metaphor. You can force those energies to enter into that configuration through various forms of yogic practices. So these are not, unlike the general Mahayana point of view, which is you sort of use philosophical analysis to induce a state in which you are seeing the nature of reality. Here we're actually using a kind of a set of mostly physiological techniques to induce something that is in which that wisdom is going to emerge, a state in which that wisdom is going to emerge. The problem, however, for Tantra is that these winds, right, these energies are already flowing, of course, And they flow in very deep patterns that basically constitute one's own ordinary identity. And so quite literally, one's own ordinary identity is the patterning of these winds. So when one is experiencing an emotional state, let's say someone has a tendency toward attachment or lust or a tendency toward aversion or anger, that is reflected in the way in which certain winds or energies are flowing in their mind-body system. So quite literally, who one is the patterning of one's energy flow. Since it's a little bit like if you wanted to kind of redirect the Colorado River from the, if it's at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you're going to have a very hard time doing it. Likewise, if you want to redirect the energies of your mind-body system so as to create that configuration that's almost death but isn't fully death, you're going to first need to get out of that very deep rut, which is your own ordinary identity. So what's the first thing to do is to stop being ordinary. So they say, Tamil ki tokshe pangba, abandon ordinary thoughts and ordinary attitudes, ordinary experience. How do you do that? So the type of tantra we're talking about here, in which Tukdam is relevant, in which this special state is relevant, is known in Tibetan as Lana Mepi Nenjor. For a long time, people translated that as Anuttara Yoga Tantra, until we discovered that actually there's no Sanskrit text that says Anuttara Yoga Tantra. So now there's I think the preferred version is Yoga Niruttara. Whatever we say in Sanskrit, what we understand it to mean, certainly what the Tibetan exegetical tradition will understand it to mean, is unexcelled Tantra. So it's the highest level of Tantric practice. There are actually lower levels, but this is the very highest level. This is the only level in which you really do this practice of simulating the death process. And certainly for the Gelugpa, that is the goal, right? There are lower levels of tantric practice you find among Gelugpa practitioners, but really, if you're a serious tantric practitioner, everyone is engaged in Lana Mepi Nenjor, unexcelled yoga tantra, and everyone is trying in some sense or another to simulate the death process. That would be, what it means to be a formal practitioner, especially as a monk in the Tibetan tradition. And the way you do that, again, is you need to abandon Talmagi Nangshen, right? Ordinary appearances, ordinary conceptualizations. And how one is going to do that? One is going to become not you. You're going to become somebody else. Specifically, you're going to become a fully enlightened tantric deity, right? And with a sense of what's called dignity or pride, right? The Hayengagya, the pride of being the deity. And there are going to be different deities that one chooses, or really, probably the best way to say it is you're chosen by the deity. And you go through an initiation process. And then once you've gone through that initiation process, then you are authorized to actually begin the practice. And the practice begins with the imagination of yourself as that deity, the visualization of yourself as the deity. And the goal is to, especially for Gelugpa practice, in this particular tradition, is to see yourself in full vividness with all of these attributes, right? This deity is called Yamantaka or Vajrabhairava, right? He's the Vajra terrifier, the one who puts an end to death. He has 9 heads, 34 arms and 16 legs. Each of these arms holds a different implement. So for example, here we have, I forget which arm number it is, but he has a little man on a spear from bottom to top, as it were. And each of these things symbolizes something. So the little man on a spear symbolizes that even the most sinful person can go from being incredibly sinful to becoming a Buddha in a single lifetime. Right? So that's part of the claim here, is that this is a very rapid path. Something that you can do you could become a Buddha instead of, traditionally they say, 3 incalculable eons. You can do it in a single lifetime. The 2 horns represent the 2 truths, ultimate reality, conventional reality. The fire on his eyebrows represents the blazing of the wisdom fire. The 5 heads on each of the 5 skulls on each of his heads represent the 5 different forms of Buddhas, who are the manifestation of 5 different kinds of wisdom, who are the transformation of 5 different kinds of fundamental confusion and negative mental states, like anger and desire. And this particular deity is a manifestation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And that's probably part of the reason why it's so popular in Gelugpa practice. So many of the subjects that we've encountered in Tukdam, or have been the subject of the research studies, they were practitioners of this deity, it appears, at least based on the data we have. So Vajrabhairava one visualizes oneself as this deity, the full form in this way, right? And then, and here we see this is a Gelugpa, this is a 20th century Gelugpa painting that has actually the blood of one of the tutors of the Dalai Lama for the red paint after he passed away. And you can see, partially you recognize that it's a Gelugpa because it has the founder Je Tsongkhapa, who I mentioned before, the great exegete and practitioner, and his two prominent disciples, Keter Je and Gyaltsab Je there up at the top. So you're visualizing yourself as this deity, but you're not doing that just sort of, you're not in your kitchen as Vajrabhairava. You're in a palace. You are in his Vajrabhairava's tantric palace, celestial palace, which is called the mandala. So this is a mandala that was created in 1985, I think, in Robert Thurman's attic, actually. And this is the Vajrabhairava mandala. It is the 13 deity form of Vajrabhairava, not the solitary hero form. And as you can see, when you see this is actually, you can kind of tell maybe by this texturing of the picture that this is all made out of sand, right? But this is actually a 2-dimensional floor plan of a 3-dimensional building. And the central deity, which are here to be Vajrabhairava, is sitting on a dais in the center here. And these are the gates that are lying flat, but they're actually, the building itself, they'd be standing up. And so one has to visualize oneself not only with all the detail of the body, but also all the detail of the mandala. And you should keep in mind all of the things that the mandala represents, all the features of the mandala. For example, each of the gates has 2 urns on either side of it. That makes a total of 8. That represents the Noble Eightfold Path. Each feature of the mandala, each major feature of the mandala also maps onto a part of the body. And that's relevant to practice. So for example, the hanging pearl nets, this is actually a parapet standing up. The hanging pearl nets represent the intestines, which are metaphorically representing a certain style of practice called tumo, this kind of practice that creates very intense heat, that is relevant actually to Tukdam. So you're supposed to visualize all of this along with yourself and the deity, and in this case you'd have 12 other deities with you that you're meant to visualize. And you should do all of that at an incredible level of detail. Now this mandala that you just saw was made by my friend who tragically passed away when he went to Columbia to study, to get a PhD, and he tragically passed away from various health issues that were probably starting in his childhood. But he was an incredible artist, and he, just a quick aside, Pema, as we know him, also then eventually ended up at Cornell. And at Cornell, he was drafted into, somehow, I don't know how this happened, but he was drafted into the NSF-funded computer graphics lab in 1987, I think it was. And I actually had taught him AutoCAD. He learned how, anyone know what AutoCAD is? This is like 1980s software. So he actually taught him, I showed him, I didn't know what AutoCAD was. I showed him a few basics, and then he learned, he became amazing in AutoCAD, and they were so impressed with his capacities that they wanted to test basically their graphic systems with something really difficult. So he made this 3-dimensional, so this is the mandala. So this 2-dimensional depiction is exactly this mandala, right? And you can see many of the same details, like the 2 urns and so on. And these are the stairs going up, and that's the gate, right? So this is the gate here. You don't really see the stairs, right? So that's how it looks. And so when one is practicing in this style of practice, this is what's called the generation stage, in which one is trying to fully become an extraordinary being, to really see oneself in this way. And there are many, many details that are necessary for this. It includes also visualizations of one's own subtle body system. And this is a simplified diagram from the Huntington archive of a slightly different tantric account, but it basically maps onto the Vajrabhairava Tantra fairly well. And the idea here is that even while you're visualizing yourself as the deity, at certain points as you advance more and more and more, and you start to get to the point where you can visualize yourself inside the mandala in a small drop on the tip of your nose, all of those details in that way. This is, again, very distinctively Gelugpa, to emphasize the importance of this kind of visualization. When you can get to that, to that extent, you're ready to start really manipulating the winds in your body. And so you do that by first just imaginatively visualizing these features of your subtle body system. You have a central channel, which is the blue channel here that starts between the eyebrows, goes up through the top of the head, comes down and ends at the end of the sexual organ. And then you have a right and a left channel. And the right and the left channel overlap at certain points. As you can see, there are these knots, what are called knots. They're overlaps. They overlap around the central channel. When one is engaged in the generation stage, one is just starting to untie the knots, as John Huntington notes there. Eventually, in the perfection stage, what's called the perfection stage, one is going to actually begin to bring the winds into the central channel. And when one is able to do so and bring them into the heart chakra, each of these overlapping points are visualized in this way. They're called chakras. The petals represent different channels that are going out throughout the body. There are different numbers. I forget. You can have a look at that book that I cited earlier about exactly how many numbers of secondary channels there are. There are different systems for that, but it's tens of thousands of secondary channels. So each of these is going out to secondary channels, and the whole body is filled with channels. But the key point here is that you're going to bring all of those winds, except for one, all of those energies, into the heart chakra and make them dissolve there. And that's when you are in a death-like state, right? So the idea is that you're preparing yourself in a certain way to die, so that when you actually die, you can then become a Buddha, because you gain this full sense, this full degree of wisdom. Now that means that we need to talk about this. We should talk about what this death process is. And there is I'm not going to go through all of these details, but this is actually from a really great book actually called Death, Intermediate State, and Rebirth by Jeffrey Hopkins. It presents the Gelugpa version of this. It is pretty similar to other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but not exactly identical. But basically, the idea here is that as one is dying, or as one is doing the simulation of death, there are certain events that occur. The external signs happen in actual death. So, let me grab a better... Just make sure not to point this at anybody. So you have these external signs. This does not happen when you simulate. This happens when you're actually dying. But in simulation, these signs do appear, the internal signs. So as this physiological process is happening, you are having a kind of a whoops, looks like it died. You're having a phenomenological experience in which, at this first stage, things look like a mirage. And that's happening where the earth element of the body is beginning to dissolve. And as that earth element is dissolving, there are these other kinds of changes are occurring physiologically if you're actually dying. But in this dissolution, when you're doing it as a practice, you don't get those physiological changes, but you do get the phenomenological event, right? And so so you're going to go through a sequence of 8 stages. You start with first the earth element dissolves. It dissolves into the water element, And then the water element, as it dissolves, you get this appearance of smoke. If you're actually dying, you get these kinds of phenomena. Of course, this applies to relatively slow process of death. If you have a very rapid death, you do get, they say that you still get some of those phenomenological signs, but obviously the physiological signs don't occur in the same way. And so as one is, so different aspects of one's mind-body system, like the aggregate of feelings or the 5 aggregates dissolves, as one is dissolving each into the next, so earth dissolves into water, water dissolves into fire. When this happens, for example, when you're actually dying, part of what happens is you can no longer smell at this point. You are starting to exhibit this kind of very characteristic type of breathing that occurs in slow forms of death, this sort of rasping breathing. And phenomenologically, you have this appearance of like fireflies, similar to sometimes when you sneeze and you might see kind of sparks come out when you sneeze. It's not the same kind of phenomenological feature. Then earth, so we have earth into water, water into fire. Fire then dissolves into the wind element. At this point then, you really have lost all sense of kind of even tactile sensation. The appearance is like a sputtering butter lamp about to go out. You really can no longer think at this point, not in any clear way. And then your gross mental functions, and these are the last stages that are the most important. Your gross mental functions then really completely cease at this point, where the wind element now has dissolved into what's called the 80 conceptions, which really aren't conceptions, they're just called that, but they're kind of like basic mental operations. And at this point then, these events do occur when you simulate. Right? So this is where the physiology of death is actually occurring in the simulation itself, because those winds are entering the central channel through this process eventually, until they finally all dissolve into the very subtle life-bearing wind in the indestructible drop at the heart. So if we go back, to this image here for a second, right, you visualize actually a blue dot at the heart. That is said to actually be then a type of substance actually, that in which the winds become dissolved at the time of death. When you do the simulation, you keep one wind out, which is actually referred to here. This life-bearing wind, the Tsogzingilung, is the one that you don't allow to penetrate into that drop, because if it does, then you die. So part of the way you can think about this process is that it's actually, again, like a simulation of the death process. And the most important point is that all of the gross level of consciousness has ceased. All that remains, they say, at this point is a kind of clear light, which is said to be like the way dawn looks in August on the plains of Tibet. I can't say that I've really experienced that myself. I've been to Tibet, but I'm too lazy to get up at dawn and look at the sky. But so the concept here is that you're actually no longer even capable of thinking. You're no longer capable of seeing. You're no longer capable of hearing, and so on. All that's left is just this kind of sheer consciousness itself, which doesn't even have a subject-object structure. So for the Gelugpas, that lack of subject-object structure is not really relevant. For the other traditions, it's extremely relevant, because it's said that if you're going to understand the nature of the mind, the fundamental distortion in the mind is precisely that subject-object structure. So you have to cultivate a non-dual awareness, and this actually induces a non-dual awareness physiologically. And the key moment here is that you have to remain aware. You have to be, one term that's used is you have to recognize consciousness itself, even at this level, even in this state. So as opposed to trying to do that through a long, let's say, philosophical process of analysis, you do it very quickly by inducing this process, and then you have that recognition. It's said that you can get there by doing like philosophical analysis, but this is using basically physiological techniques to get to the same place phenomenologically. So that's what Tukdam is. Theoretically, it is this clear light of death that is induced through practice. And so if someone is a Gelugpa practitioner, who will mostly be monks, they are going to engage in this practice by doing something called taking the three states as paths for three bodies, the kusum langkir. So they take that moment of death as a way of cultivating what's called the dharmakaya, or chukiku in Tibetan, which means basically the mind of a fully enlightened Buddha. Or if they don't manage to do that, then they're going to arise out of this, so that same process, that dissolution process that we talked about, which has those 8 stages, that goes in reverse. And when you arise out of that process, and what happens? You enter into what's called the intermediate state, which in Tibetan is the bardo, right? And then if you're able to, as you're rising in that way, if you're able to, again, recognize what's happening as you're rising out of the clear light, then you could attain Buddhahood, not in the mind of the Buddha, but in what's called the celestial body, or the Sambhogakaya, the Longchukiku. And then finally, you will be in the intermediate state, or the bardo, for up to 49 days, it is said. At each 7 days, you die again. You have a kind of, like a body made out of basically mind stuff, Yiki Ranjingulu. And so that mind body dies every 7 days. And if you stay more than 49, everyone's got to leave the bardo. It's like this, limit on the, I don't know, it's like a limited reservation. You get 49 days, you got to go. If you somehow don't manage to really take a normal rebirth, then one interpretation is you become a ghost. So you can also actually, when you arise out of the bardo into your next life, at that moment there's another opportunity, and you could become a Buddha at that moment as well. And now what's called the emanation body, the Nirmanakaya, or the Truku of a Buddha. So this is the main practice of Gelugpa monks. Right? So theoretically, it's especially, and the one that's considered to be best is the first one. You take the moment of death as an opportunity to realize the Dharmakaya of a Buddha. If you're able to do that, you have become fully enlightened. And what you're doing is you're basically, instead of dying in a way, you're becoming a Buddha. And death is over for you. And the future now is just your Buddha activity, as they call it, the Chinle. So Gelugpa practice is all about this. It involves specific kinds of visualizations in the Vajrabhaidava Tantra and some others. The way in which you rehearse the death process, even quite early in the generation stage, when you're doing all of that imaginative stuff of yourself as the deity and so on, that's all going to be laid out very ritually. And ritual is a big part of what's happening in Tantra. The creation of that sort of alternative reality, in a sense, requires the use of ritual. I think it makes a lot of sense. But at certain points in that ritual, there are going to be moments of dissolution. And that dissolution, you go through those 8 stages, you rehearse them, you remember that you're going to see a mirage, and you're going to see smoke, you're going to see a butter lamp, and so on. And the visualization is this syllable is at the heart. And the process of dissolution of the 8 stages is connected to the dissolution of the syllable. So you imagine that syllable dissolving in stages, and as you imagine it dissolving in stages, those are corresponding to those different stages of the death process. Until it finally ends at the very top of the little squiggle there, and now you're in the clear light, right? So that's the typical practice. So that's theory. So it's like nice and neat, isn't it? It's like, it makes a lot of sense, and maybe. But, I can make it sound like it does make a lot of sense, actually. It's quite brilliant. I did have an opportunity in the 90s. I haven't really published academic work on this, but I worked with Bob Thurman in the 90s on translating some texts, especially a very influential text for this material called the Ngaran Chamo by Jade Tsongkhapa. And it still hasn't been published yet, but someday. And so it's really quite amazing when you get into the exegetical literature, how precise they can be. And again, the Gelugpa really strongly emphasize the kind of precision of this whole visualization process. So I'm anticipating myself. So let me talk about Tukdam on the ground. It's not so like neat and tidy. It's much more complicated. It's kind of like, being in a crowd at a Kala Chakra initiation. This is the 1991 Kala Chakra initiation, where people are shoving, and if you don't shove, it means you don't care. So you have to shove, and it's messy. So what's one messy thing is, well, is it happening? So a key aspect of Tukdam culturally is that some people have to go into Tukdam because they're high lamas. And if they're high Gelugpa lamas, they definitely have to go into Tukdam. If they don't go into Tukdam, they weren't a high lama. So that's kind of, apodictic. It's not a synthetic relationship. It's an analytic one. It's like, for sure, you are a high lama if and only if you go into Tukdam when you die. That is just understood. It's also not, even if the lama sort of says, oh, I'm not going to be able to do it, guys, all of his devotees are going to say, he did it. I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that we know that. And then the Tibetan community themselves also know this, by the way. Right? So when you're trying to identify a Tukdam, there are many cases of Tukdams and practitioners who are not that famous or don't have that many disciples. But there are cases of famous lamas with disciples. And then other people sort of say, oh yeah, of course he went into Tukdam. It's not like the Tibetan community isn't aware of this issue. Just like the issues around the recognition of tulkus or reincarnate lamas. Another question is, how long does it take to know? A very typical thing you hear is 3 days, but that's completely not true, actually. It's you could talk to people who will say 20 minutes, you'll know in 20 minutes. People say you'll know in 3 hours. I've heard a wide variety of reports. So that's not standardized. Even the signs of Tukdam are not standardized. We'll talk more about it. But one key feature is actually, can you have a little putrefaction? Can there be a little decomposition and it's still Tukdam? How much decomposition can you have and it's still Tukdam? Right? So those are key issues. Another issue, actually, interestingly, is it a good thing? So one key point here is that most of the subjects that we've encountered are from the Gelugpa tradition. An explanation of this is something I've mentioned a few times, which is that when you do that intense level of focus on the visualization, it kind of stabilizes your control of those winds so that when you get to the point in which you're dying, you have a much more stable kind of capacity for controlling the winds than practitioners who didn't do that much visualization. So that's one explanation, an intriguing one. It's a possible explanation. But the other traditions, and I've heard this from several well-known teachers, but none of this has been studied systematically yet, so it really has to be taken as anecdotal. I don't know, is ethnography just anecdotal stuff? But anyway, sorry to you anthropologists. But my ethnography has, I've encountered several people in the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions who say, oh, Tukdam, yeah, people go in Tukdam, but it's like, not that big a deal. We don't care that much. Part of the reason they don't care that much is that the idea that you need to go into this completely kind of a state where there's no phenomenal content, there's just a pure clear light mind, actually is something that many of the contemporary practitioners and teachers in those lineages don't agree with. They think that you can attain non-dual awareness with full phenomenal content. Right? So they often cite this famous phrase that Tilopa said to Naropa, Pu nangmi ching, shenbe ching. My child, you are not bound by phenomenal appearance, you're bound by your clinging to it. Right? So the idea here is you can attain full non-dual awareness, that leads to Buddhahood. You actually become a Buddha according to some accounts. When that awareness is fully present, you are a Buddha because you already are a Buddha actually. So all of this stuff about getting rid of all of the complicated mind and going down to the clear light is kind of, yeah, it could be good, but you don't need it. Right? So there's that. Like, how important is it? And secondly, is it a good thing to be in Tukdam for a long time? So some of you may have heard about the case of a well-known previous Lama who, when he passed away, he was in Tukdam, I can't remember how long, more than 3 weeks, I believe. And then when he was recognized, so the whole idea also here, by the way, is you can control your rebirth, even if you don't become a Buddha. Through these practices, you gain the capacity to control your rebirth to some extent. And then when you're reborn, you can be recognized as the rebirth of some previous great practitioner. And let's just say that the rebirth of that great Lama was, someone who was not as good a scholar as he was. And then one explanation was, oh, he was in Tukdam too long. Do you hear that story? That's kind of common. I'm not using the name just because, out of respect, but many people in the Tibetan community know that story. It's like, oh, yeah. So, that's just interesting in itself. Then there's also kind of the whole question of what the practitioner history is. And this is one of the big problems right now. Tukdam regularly occurs in non-experts. Right? You find, people who are not great trained Trantic practitioners who know all the commentaries and, who aren't even monks or nuns. We're just ordinary lay people, and they go into Tukdam. And this has recently led to some interesting conversations, some of them available on video, in which, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and others have been generating a new term, which is Tukdam Senipa in Tibetan, which means real Tukdam, basically, like actual Tukdam, authentic Tukdam, fully qualified Tukdam. Because, how could some grandma do this if she's never, it doesn't... So it is really kind of this is a real issue. Now, on the other hand, there is a long history in Tantric context where anyone could be a great Tantric practitioner. Like any of you could be a great Mahasiddha just pretending to be, listening to me politely. But nevertheless, this has become a real issue for the community. And it is, it's like, why would it happen to someone like that? One account is that actually it's actually not a good thing that's happening, it's a bad thing. They're stopping the death process at a certain point because of attachment. And so they're kind of stuck before they're really all the way into the clear light. So that would actually be a bad thing, right? So again, I don't mean at all to be disrespectful here, but I do think that these are issues. These issues really point to the incredible variability of this phenomenon in a cultural way. And that has led to a number of problems. One of them, here's a couple more. Does it matter if you make sound when someone's in Tukdam? I've heard, basically this is a yes or no question, although there is a kind of intermediate which is not too much sound. But it's mostly yes or no. And you hear people on both sides. Great people who are experts in Tantra, and they say, oh, you can make as much sound as you want. They can't hear anything. And of course, theoretically, they shouldn't be able to hear anything because in that stage of dissolution, right, their senses are going, right? They can't hear, this is not even, we're only at the water element, and they shouldn't be able to hear anything anymore. Right? We're right at the beginning. They shouldn't be able to hear anything anymore. So why should it matter if you make sound? Can you move the person? Again, lots of disagreement. We know of one case in which a person was in Tukdam, died in a hospital, was put on a kind of stretcher in a jeep and drove on bouncy roads back to the monastery, and he was still in Tukdam. So does it matter if you move the person? Does it matter if the people around you are upset, even if they're not making noise, if they're all unhappy? This is another thing you'll hear different opinions on. When Tukdam stops, is it just because is the only way you know it's decomposition? Or it's said that there will be these white and red drops that will emerge from the body at different places. Right? Does this have to happen for it to be over? What we see in cases is that there's very sudden, I'll talk about some cases in a moment. There's very sudden decomposition when the Tukdam ends. You can have people who have been in Tukdam for 27 days, and then as one of the cases that we're going to be publishing on soon. And on the 28th day, it's like very dramatic decomposition. Just boom, it seems to happen. So is that the key, or is there more to it? Is there something about this change in smell that happens? And I'll talk about smell in a second. Oh, that should say Tukdam in research, I'm sorry. So this is the kind of issues we've been dealing with our Tibetan collaborators and the scientists who have been working on it. I just want to say myself that I've really benefited a lot from engaging with these collaborators, and I'm just really reporting out to you because the people who've really been doing the work on the ground are like this fella right here. I'll say more about Dylan Lott, but there's also a couple of guys in the audience. David Perlman, who was very important in the beginning of this work, and Joe worked on this as well, so formerly from the Center for Healthy Minds. So this is the FMed project is the field study of the physiology of long-term meditation practitioners. It began in 2012. Its focus was neuroscience, right? Really looking at the brain. It's based on a consensus view of what are the clear cases of Tukdam. And it's a really, broader collaboration that's expanded even further in a way I'll mention soon, involving what we call MINZICOM, the Tibetan Medical and Astrological Institute, Delek Hospital in Dharamsala, the Office of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and lots of assistants from various monasteries. And I just want to do a shout out to two postdocs that I've worked with directly, who I was one of their advisors, Dylan Lott, who was a postdoc and worked for several years on this. He's a postdoc in the Center for Healthy Minds, and now currently Tony Tidwell, who's picked up from where Dylan left off. And a lot of the work you see here is actually coming from Dylan, including, no, actually not these photos. So the consensus in terms of so we had to come to some kind of way of operationalizing Tukdam, to use the scientific term, or defining it. And these were basically the kinds of clear signs that we would agree on, that were agreed upon. And there was a process with our Tibetan collaborators, this is still going on, and they would contact people, find out if there's a case, and so on. The decomposition is greatly inhibited, right? So we have a case that's up to, of one that was 37 days long, where there's very little decomposition, including no significant rigor mortis. Their body retains a kind of freshness, especially around the torso, the central torso. This complexion is said to be radiant. There is a kind of unusual odor that's not an odor of decomposition. And there is said to be heat felt at the heart center. So those were kind of the initial, some of the initial criteria. But this one in particular eventually has not applied because there may be heat when someone puts their hand there. They may feel heat, but there's no infrared coming from that, from what we can tell. And actually David was someone who's worked on this. There doesn't seem to be any significant extra heat at the heart center. This is something we're quite interested in now, but we haven't really measured yet. These are things that we are quite interested in, obviously decomposition too. But the protocol that was developed in terms of research design, first of all, went through a very elaborate IRB process, really trying to be culturally sensitive. And the key hypothesis was basically that if consciousness is somehow sustained in Tukdam, which it's supposed to be, right? Because you're realizing the nature of the mind in Tukdam, then there should be some kind of brain activity. If you're a neuroscientist anyway, that's what you think. Said, no apologies, sorry guys. But, and so maybe that kind of brain activity you find is the kind you find in minimally conscious states or even vegetative states. So some support for this idea that this postmortem brain activity comes from a few studies on animals, mice, where there's a really pronounced spike, an EEG spike, and I can provide you with the details if you like. Postmortem, also decapitating mice produces a profound spike at postmortem. And there's been a limited amount of research in humans on this, which has found in just a couple of subjects a kind of a small degree of EEG detectable activity post-mortem for a very short period of time. So what it was used was a mismatched negativity bias and the audio brainstem response, and these guys could say much more about it than I can. Basically, the idea is that there are different kind of theoretical accounts about what's going on here, but in this one, you send a series of tones, and then there's an anomalous tone. And even if the subject's paying no attention at all, and even if they can't engage in any kind of, appear to be incapable of engaging in any higher order thought, the brain will still show a response that's measurable in EEG to that anomalous tone. So one account, for example, is that the brain is based on prediction. So the brain is prediction. So when there's an anomaly, that anomaly is going to be salient. And if sound, if the auditory capacity was something that's really important for survival and evolved in that way, then maybe it's at a very basic level we are attuned to anomalous sound. So who knows? A similar kind of paradigm is used for the auditory brainstem response. And both of these are used in cases where people, for example, mismatched negativity can correlate with, it can indicate whether someone is going to arise out of a vegetative state into a minimally conscious state, for example. So it can have clinical application. And again, it involves putting earphones on the subject and sending tones. So we did this. We also gathered, and like David did this in the field, we gathered physiological and visual data, and like around skin tone and so on, and images, many images. And this was our first empirical article in 2021, and the result is nothing. Like there is no EEG signal. And I'm going to end soon. So this null finding, I think, is important. Null findings are important, and scientists are, discouraged from publishing them because, I don't know, it's, especially if you're a young scientist, it looks better if you discover something instead of you discover that there isn't something, even though that could be equally important. But the one question would be, why did we ever think that sound would be detectable for these subjects? Like, why did we think that? I wasn't there when the protocol was designed, so I'm almost asking you guys, like, why did we think that? Why would we think the brain is involved? Right? So this is actually a kind of something that is being critiqued in neuroscience lately, even by some neuroscientists and certainly by other people like Evan Thompson, the philosopher. The kind of brain centrism, which says that consciousness is in the brain. Instead of thinking about, and we already know to some degree that, for example, your microbiome actually seems to have an effect on your conscious states, and vice versa. So if the gut and the brain are kind of interacting to produce consciousness, that seems to suggest that consciousness is not just in the brain. If we think of that then also that consciousness is about a kind of environment, and it's about being embedded socially and so on, then, kind of brain centrism could be a real problem. Another thing that is an issue is that we never got to subjects, and I shouldn't say we, because, it was people who were in the field, like Dylan most recently. The subjects that were in that study were mostly measured by Dr. Dylan Lott or his colleagues. And they, the earliest one was, I think, 36 hours after death. And most of them were days later. So the thought was, well, what if we could actually get to a subject in real time while they're dying? Maybe there'll be an EEG signal that it occurs. Maybe we'll get something on mismatched negativity, right? What's called the ERP. Maybe we'll get that, right? 5 minutes later. And the question that I have to ask about that is why? Well, if we don't have it 3 days later, why do we think if it occurs then that somehow is relevant? And then the other one is, might that actually happen in humans anyway? A lot of humans, even if we found something. So why, if we found something but it's gone 5 days later, why did we think that was necessary for Tukdam? And if we do find something and it's gone 5 days later, which is uniformly the case, then why did we? Why don't we look at a bunch of other non-practitioners who wanted Tukdam and see if we'd see the same thing? Which has not really been done. So anyway, there's a new approach. We brought in forensic scientists, and we have a paper that hopefully will be coming out soon with the help of some great forensic scientists to at least establish that the rate of decomposition really is unusual. And it is. I mean, it clearly seems to be the case that you have someone in Tukdam for 37 days in India, in South India. It's like, something's going on. And here we want to say, however, that we're going to move away from the brain and toward, I love this term, toward what neuroscientists call the periphery, which is the rest of the body. And so, like, we're really going to look at biological measures. We're going to look at smell also. And then we're also very interested in maybe looking at candidates while they're still alive, to try to understand, is there something about those people, those practitioners, especially Gelugpa practitioners, who maybe could give us a clue to what this amazing phenomenon is, this really remarkable phenomenon is. Here we're collaborating now with a big team of people led by Dr. Svyatoslav Medvedev and in St. Petersburg. And they have a team in India. And that's also been helpful to have those new collaborators. But also, I'm really hoping that we're going to start asking questions that Dylan Lott was asking, that Tony Tidwell, the postdoc working on this now, is asking, both of whom are trained as anthropologists, is like really trying to understand also, like, what does this stuff mean? And how does it matter, really? In a recent, a few months, I guess it was last year or sometime, His Holiness Dalai Lama, the video is available, I believe, on YouTube. His Holiness Dalai Lama met with the Russian team. We didn't have any representatives there. And as part of the discussion, the translation into English wasn't so great, but at one point in Tibetan, the Dalai Lama is sort of speaking, and I don't believe this is translated in English, and he said, I'm really not sure how important this is. Like, you know, does this really matter if we find out that something happens after Tukdam? You know, that science can measure it. But actually, I do think, and the whole project started really as a conversation between Richie Davidson, the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, both of whom are close friends. There is something remarkable that can really change our way of thinking about death. And really seeing death not as just this kind of on-off switch, but as a kind of process, right? In the Buddhist world, we even, in a way, you can say you're always dying. You're already dying. So just thinking about it in those terms, what's the cultural impact of thinking about life as death, actually, as a process that maybe never ends? Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks to our great funders, Hershey Family Foundation in particular, Peggy Hedberg, Fran Orrick, and the huge FMed team, Richie as the boss, and Dylan and Tony have done a lot of the actual work, and these guys I would thank too, who were involved a few years ago. And then, of course, Office of the Dalai Lama and Dr. Tseon Tamdrin from the school from Menzikang, and Dr. Tsen Dorji Sarutsang, who is a physician for His Holiness. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over a couple of minutes here, but I think there's time, about 20 minutes for questions if you like. Thank you. No questions. Everybody's in Tukdam.
I have a question about research on POA. Is there anything that you know about that?
I have not
a study conducted in Japan.
Oh, really?
On Ayan Rinpoche, who is this renowned POA
yes.
expert, and they were trying to research similar things just from that direction.
I haven't heard of any of that.
Okay.
I mean,
Thought you might know more.
No, I haven't heard about that. So that's interesting, though. You would certainly, because there are physical signs of POA, like the scab or even the supposed opening and stuff, that presumably would make it maybe in some ways easier to study, but also because people aren't dead yet.
Yeah.
But
it's another simulation of.
It is another simulation, exactly.
And apparently, vital signs cease for the great POA practitioner.
Oh, is that right? Okay, yes. And also in the clear light, it's said that the respiration stops. If you really get to clear light, your respiration stops completely. I don't remember what they say about the heart, but the respiration is meant to stop. So. When you do the simulation. Yeah, POER would be really interesting. POER is a kind of practice of transference of consciousness that you can do for yourself when you die, or you can do for somebody else. There's also the illegal version where you send your consciousness as you're dying into somebody else's body, but that's not legal anymore. Called Drongjuk.
Don't let Peter Thiel find out.
Yeah, don't let Peter Thiel find out. Yes, I think you were next. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So when you were talking about, grandmama and posse experiencing it, is there any discussion that, maybe they have some past life affinity for it, or
so that is certainly the kind of explanation that will come up. Oh, actually they were a practitioner in their last life and this is like kind of leftover. Or in combination with that, they were a secret practitioner and they were a practitioner in their past life. It's just nobody knew, And then there are traditions who sort of say, like, thematize literally the grandma as someone who could realize the nature of the mind just as well or even better than the great scholar. But those traditions tend to not emphasize Tukdam. So, yeah. Sure, yes, go ahead. And then we'll take yours.
A question about Tukdam duration and how much variability there is. Is the thinking there that part of this is somewhat performative and a display for devotees, so the length of Tukdam might be longer, allowing more devotees to come pay their respects or just be in the presence?
So pretty much, especially in India, you can't, the body can't be rotting. So so for high lamas who are not necessarily Gelugpa lamas, they'll say Tukdam is 1 or 2 days or even just a few hours because there's less emphasis on it. Generally like 3 days is a kind of typical time. But that's also might be a time in which obvious decomposition will not happen. But once obvious decomposition happens, and especially if there's a smell of decomposition, not the special smell, but this other rotting smell, then no one thinks Tukdam's happening anymore. I think there was one case where they were kind of insisting, but basically you can't pretend at that point. So, but it has a performative aspect to it. And but that's maybe, not sure I want to use that term. It has a devotional aspect that's really authentic. And there's a gray area, like whether someone's in Tukdam or not. It could be a gray area for like up to 3 days perhaps. So I don't see that as necessarily problematic. It's just that if you're trying to study it scientifically and you're doing this kind of measurement, then you need to make a call. And that's been a very delicate issue. And that whole issue of like the new term Tukdam Tsenipa, authentic Tukdam or fully qualified Tukdam is really uncomfortable, I think, for the whole team. Certainly for me. Like, I don't want to be the one who's deciding whether someone's really in Tukdam or not. Let's just say I'm not qualified. Yes?
Please go back to the phenomenological science of the Buddhism. And I'm just, have a few closely related questions.
Right, so this is the sequence. That's the first stage.
Yeah, so during the simulated experience, what exactly, so you have the mind of black mirror.
Yeah, that's the penultimate one.
Yes, and after the black mirror attainment, there is a clear light.
Correct, yes.
And do you have the full, I guess something is a little bit different, right? That's why the actual attainment is not realized during the simulated.
So this is you do go through this phase in the simulation, but the Sokzin Gelung has not penetrated in, if I'm remembering correctly, the Sokzin Gelung has not penetrated into the heart chakra, into the tigle, into the drop. So therefore, like the phenomenal appearances are, I guess, indistinguishable. I haven't really read anything that says one way or the other. but the body doesn't go into actual decomposition or doesn't go into actual death.
I think you mentioned in this state there's no dualistic.
Yes, correct. Because actually, probably like really here, when the 80 conceptions have dissolved, then you can't, subject-object structures die.
But do you still have the self-grasping ignorance?
As a latent thing, yes. You have what's called the bakchak, the imprint. Yes.
And in the actual Tukdam, there is no self-grasping.
No, there could be. There could be. So you could get to Tukdam, but you might not. So this is a complicated area that I'm not very good at, although I did direct a dissertation on some of this stuff. But so this is what they call paths and stages, salam. And basically, once you have that realization of the ultimate nature of reality, you're now on what's called the first stage, the first path, or the first bodhisattva stage, the path of seeing. But then you have to go through a long process, but with Tantra it can be a very fast process, where you deepen that, you stabilize it, and it begins to uproot the imprints for ignorance. So even though ignorance is not active, there's an imprint for it, like basically a karmic imprint. And so you have to have a very profound, very powerful realization in order to really completely eliminate that, which means you may need to do it again and again and again. If you use non-tantric methods, it takes you 3 eons. If you use a tantric method, it takes you 1 lifetime, but it's also said to be very dangerous because you can kill yourself, for one thing, and you could also go crazy and such things.
So the one mind that the wind that doesn't enter the
Yes.
that is the reason why this simulated experience is not as
Not actual, yes. Yeah, I guess that must be. Yeah, it must. I mean, I haven't really seen an explanation, or maybe I have and I've just forgotten. But there must be something about the full, like having all the winds dissolve, that is somehow produces a more powerful state of mind. So one way of thinking about it is that mind is extremely intense, and it has, one way that's characterized as great bliss. So perhaps part of the idea is that the great bliss is actually even more intense when all the winds enter the heart. But there's probably an explanation about that somewhere, but I don't remember it.
And how is this sequence of events, how is this different in the deep sleep? I think similar things will happen.
Yes, you go through, you go through these kinds of dissolutions when you fall asleep, when you wake up. Sometimes they say when you sneeze. Not all the way, but a certain portion of them. When you have an orgasm, right? But it's sometimes very, very fast, or it's kind of incomplete.
And why use this if we have deep sleep?
You can you don't do it in deep sleep. You do it in the transition. But what I've heard, I haven't read this in a text, but in the transition, that kind of, the intensity of that state, which you can create by doing these yogic exercises, some of which are really very vigorous, like you're not just meditating quietly, you're doing some very vigorous movement, that creates this kind of intensity and clarity that's very difficult to get when you're transitioning into the dream state. But you do, that's one of the practices you do, the transition into the dream state, to prepare for this. So you do, and ideally you remain conscious all the way into the dream state. But that's very difficult, because sleep has this quality of one term they use like this, tukbo, it's like thick, it sort of deadens you. In a way that this practice does. This practice actually makes it's very intense, which is one of the reasons it's dangerous, because you can get wind illness from it. Soklung.
So I'm really curious about this new debate that you were talking about around false or real Tukdam and false Tukdam.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that's something that sort of came out as like a consequence of this project, But specifically, I remember that when we had the little mini conference, several of the people that were there sort of presented what seemed to be already established knowledge about the idea that there was a false Tukdam that could occur with practitioners who had just done a lot of shamatha practice but nothing tantric. Is that different than what this new debate is about?
I think it's, I hadn't remembered that, so thank you for reminding me. Which conference are you talking about?
That we had in Madison where, Andrew Holishek, Mark.
Oh, right, no, I wasn't there, yeah. Yeah.
I think you were there.
Was I? I wasn't really there. But anyway,
You're a hard man to schedule.
yeah, there is, so, I mean, that's part of the debate, is because there's so much stuff about generation stage. If you're doing shamatha, is that what's inducing this, right, in Gelugpa practitioners? But I think the consensus is that you need shamatha to get Tukdam. You're not, in the Gelugpa world, the assumption is you've got some degree, maybe not full-blown shamatha, but you've got a very stable mind, otherwise you can't get Tukdam. So this is more like people who aren't practitioners in any obvious way. How are they getting into Tukdam? Or people who are practitioners but don't seem to be that realized?
So on what basis are they saying that they are in Tukdam? Is it just that they're not decomposing?
Yes,
Or are they
yeah.
actually smelling the siltrum and the karma and like are all those other signs occurring? Are they staying warm around the heart?
Nobody's staying warm around the heart as far as we can tell, but meaning actually, or infrared wise, but which doesn't mean that you couldn't have a phenomenal thing, but
I mean,
it's basically non-decomposition. It's non-decomposition.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the inhibit. They do decompose, all of them a little bit, right? But
Everyone does. Well, mostly.
speak for yourself, no, but they do. You'd see some degree of decomposition in pretty much every case, but it can be really quite arrested. Yes, Donald.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there also a tradition of saying that, again, the moment of death, your state of mind at that time is so important?
Yes.
And I've heard many lamas give examples where if somebody has great devotion, it might be the kind of grandmother style, and okay, they don't have to have done their tantric practices.
Yes, yeah.
But if you have this mind of devotion towards your guru or the Buddha or whatever,
Yes.
at the moment of death, or also great compassion. Like these two things can apparently precipitate, but then I think this kind of feeds into this question of like good Tukdams versus like stable ones and non-stable ones. So these people then, if you shake around or poke or talk loudly, they might get disturbed.
Okay.
Like somebody who's a great meditator.
Do you remember if those were Gelugpa lamas who said that?
No. In terms of just talking about devotion.
Yeah.
No, this was Nyingma and Kagyu.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I rest my case.
I've heard somebody has told me that you jokingly sometimes refer to the Tukdam project as the Gelugpa project.
Yeah.
So
Someone's putting words in my mouth, even though they might be kind of accurate. But I was trained very heavily in Gelugpa stuff, and I still feel like that. But it's like being a Catholic: once a Gelugpa, always a Gelugpa. But I.
closer to being Protestant.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But I think that, really the kind of the theoretical stuff I think is extremely helpful for understanding what might be happening. But that I think that if you take the theoretical account, then that devotion stuff doesn't work. Because it's like you have to know what emptiness is.
Yeah, but in these lines, right, devotion is supposed to be a kind of shortcut to nature of mind.
Yes.
It's the closest you get to nature of mind through these kinds of easy...
If you're not a Gelugpa.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is not a conversation, the whole thing about Tukdam Senyipa is happening among Gelugpas.
Right.
I hope I don't get myself in too much trouble. Can you edit all this out?
So if you're not an erudite Gelugpa monk, essentially.
Essentially, in a way, yeah. It's hard to explain then. Like or at least you're a serious practitioner who's learned the 6 yogas of Naropa. Right? Maybe you're not that good at the text, but you're a serious, you have some basic understanding of emptiness and, of the philosophy, but you're like really good at the 6 yogas of Naropa, which are preparatory to doing this. But if you're just, some ordinary guy, vegetable seller, whatever, and even though there are all these stories about those kinds of figures in the tantric lineages, it doesn't fit with the theoretical account. That's why I went through the theoretical account, because you see that there's a certain kind of there is a certain kind of, disparity between, this is theoretical stuff. It's like you go through all that theoretical stuff, and then it's like, then you have all this. And it's just not that, it doesn't align with the theory that much sometimes. But, I think, that whole thing about its devotion and everything is totally true. But then Tukdam's totally irrelevant in that case. You don't need Tukdam. You just nature of the mind is like, boom, you're right there.
I think it's just important to be pointed out, like some very high Kagyu lamas or teachers, when I ask them, what about having to go through this dissolution process? Kind of Gurya Samaja stage, and they're like, forget about it. That's all you need to do is just to have this stable recognition of the nature of mind at the moment of death.
Yes, that is definitely true. You need if you have a stable recognition of the nature of the mind at the moment of death, that's one way of understanding Tukdam, but not in this theoretical framework, right? And it's also a totally different kind of training. And you don't need Tukdam to have a stable realization of the nature of the mind. You can do it right now. So it becomes much less important, right? That's part of the reason why they talk about, the 6 bardos. It's like you're always in a bardo. So you're always kind of dying each moment. Like there's the bardo between thoughts and the bardo between moments. And so it becomes much less important. And even it could be a trap. So, but yeah, this is a very good point, that there is a whole nother account that I didn't talk about. But that's, Joe, I think, had a... Yes, Joe.
Yeah, so I'm also thinking back to, this project's always been extreme in terms of the questions you'd like to study and the questions that are feasible scientifically to do that. And given that in this account that there are Gelug practitioners who are cultivating these various stages of dissolution during their lives, I'm wondering, especially as this project continues, are there discussions of trying to access those people or study the phenomena in an easier context than around the time of death, or at least?
Yes. So there is there's been talk, and it's sort of a little in limbo right now, but we've got some possible collaborators in India to do actual some EEG studies on living practitioners who are doing this style of practice. Because what we do know is that the majority of cases, I think the vast majority of cases, are in Gelugpa practitioners. And certainly the ones we've measured anyway. They're, how frequent, we don't really even know how frequent Tukdam is, like in the general population among Tibetans. And we don't even know whether maybe it happens to Irishmen. I mean, who knows?
I described this to someone who said that her father had been a Zen priest, and when he died, that all the things I described happened, but no one really talked about it because it wasn't really something that...
Yeah, I mean, we don't really even know that. And we don't know the rates, the base rates of the population, the Tukdam base rate in the Tibetan population, leave alone more generally, we really don't know.
Remember, trying to figure out who the control group would be in there.
Yeah, right. I mean, one interesting thing, I'll just say anecdotally, and we should stop soon, but so I had 2 family members at separate times pass away at Calvary Hospital in New York, which is, I think, the oldest hospice hospital in the United States. And so I got to sort of, know people who worked there and did my ethnography. And, they say, I mean, multiple of them, it wasn't just one person, said, well, we don't, when people are pronounced dead by our doctor, we don't move them. because sometimes they come back, after 20 minutes or something. And, so I don't know if anyone studied that, for example, but it's really quite interesting. There's so much about death that I think, certainly culturally, my impression in the United States is that we tend to run away from it and try to keep it hidden. So maybe that's part of the problem. But I guess we could take one quick question, if it's a quick question, and then... Yes?
I'll ask you two, and you can pick one. Maybe the second is more interesting.
Okay.
But you haven't mentioned rainbow body at all, and I'm wondering if there's overlapping Tukdam and rainbow body phenomenon.
There would be in the traditions that Dunne was talking about, definitely.
Okay. Not so much among...
Not in the theoretical account I provided to you from the Gelugpa perspective. So I was trying to give you, so part of it also is what I'm trying to represent to you is the kind of theoretical background when His Holiness the Dalai Lama is talking about this with us or with, more broadly with other researchers. Like what's the theoretical framework that's being used there? That's when I said, like, I'm trying to, if you go to a particular kind of scholar that is kind of connected, that we've been talking to, basically. Yeah.
And the second question, you mentioned cultural sensitivity in navigating some of those issues, but didn't really get into that. Do you want to just comment on some of the challenges your team ran into?
There are lots of things. I mean, the one thing that we're all uncomfortable about is the idea of being the ones who decide whether something's real Tukdam, so we're very careful to say that we're not doing that, even though there is that kind of happens in the field. So that's an issue, being very sensitive to what if it's a relatively high lama or even not that high, there'll be other monks, who are attending to that person and just being very sensitive to what their desires are. But I haven't been there, and David has been in actual cases. And you want to say anything about kinds of stuff you ran into?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be another 2-hour lecture just about the cultural and ethical questions and concerns here. We haven't even started to talk about organ donation and brain death and things like that and implications for, I'm glad you mentioned the hospice care and not disturbing the body and stuff like that, but I don't really, well, I guess I did just add a couple of things. I don't have that much to add other than what he said, although, it's kind of an opening the floodgates thing. Like, as soon as you start poking at any of those topics, you open all kinds of questions.
So, yeah, and one basic, yeah, go ahead.
I was just reminded an interview I did with one of the Tibetan medicine team members, Dr. Nawan Jinpa from Mensakan in India. He's been collaborating for years with this. They collect the data and kind of do reach out to the Tibetan communities as Tibetans. Obviously, it's a sensitive time and so forth. And I was kind of asking him, well, how does he feel about this, and that does he have any misgivings and so forth? And he said that, actually, like a part of him is kind of really very uncomfortable about doing this because, he thinks that there is this possibility that you might be actually disturbing somebody's meditation. And that could have obviously disastrous consequences for them within this system of thought. But then, he referred to some people like Samdhan Rinpoche and some other masters who kind of say that if it's a good practitioner, then it doesn't matter what you do. And then here again, like it seems that the kind of initiative of the Dalai Lama is really important.
Yeah.
Because he was saying that, the Dalai Lama believes that this scientific project kind of can, in the long run, contribute something to humanity. And I think what His Holiness thinks it will contribute is, these big questions about consciousness continuing beyond death and a different understanding of consciousness. So kind of on balance, it's therefore okay. It's like you're sacrificing some individual discomfort with individual cases for like a bigger, important mission that is compassionate and for humanity or something. That's how he explained it to me. So he was clearly kind of wrestling with these issues.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of, and we should stop, but just like one way of thinking about it is it's showing respect to this individual. And so touching them, measuring their skin tone, all of that stuff could be disturbing their meditation, but also you just wouldn't do that to a lama, It's like if the Pope was lying there, or something. I mean, you just think of someone you really respect. You know, you're going to start putting things on there. It's just there's a real sense of discomfort because there's a very strong tradition of showing deep respect to even the body of you know, someone like that. So I think a lot of the cultural sensitivities are around that issue.
Of course, there's the question of, you know, are people freely, like, are people actually giving informed consent to participate in the study?
Or who should be giving the
Who should
consent?
be giving consent?
What does it mean to have a letter from His Holiness saying
Yeah.
this is a really good idea?
So the consenting has been done by, you know, with the attendants basically, or sometimes monastic administration. But you know, the individual, since in every case we've only gotten to the individual after they've been dead for like almost usually a full day at least. It's kind of hard to get consent.
I guess the good news is that from the point of view of our IRB, after the people are dead from a Western point of view, our IRB isn't really that concerned about their consent anymore.
Yeah, but they're concerned about the people.
They're concerned about the people around them, so
Yeah.
they're the ones that the communication comes
Yeah.
from.
Right, I know. It's the on-off switch of death. Anyway, we're over time, and I just wanted to thank you all for great questions and for your attention. You were not an enormous audience, but a very active one, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.